After studying this module, we shall be able to learn about the effects of inflation on economic classes and learn about the economic effects of inflation.
Inflation is an intractable problem of an economy. Every citizen of the country feels some degree of inflation. The effect of inflation are all pervasive. The effects of inflation can be favorable or unfavorable depending on the rate of inflation. The average rise in the general price is called inflation. Due to inflation, the purchasing power of money reduces as too much money is needed to buy only few goods. In the short run, there is a positive relationship between the moderate rate of inflation and economic growth. It means a moderate rate of inflation causes economic growth in the country, but an unanticipated rate of inflation creates a feeling of uncertainty, and it becomes very difficult for the people to determine the course of their response to the price changes. Due to these uncertainties, it also becomes very difficult for companies to plan long term. The myth that everyone is worse off when prices rise is not true. Some people get hurt by inflation while the others are helped by inflation. This happens because there are two sides of every market transaction. A price to the buyer is an income to the seller. People are hurt by inflation when the rise in their nominal income is less than the rise in average price. On the other hand, people are helped by inflation when their nominal income rises faster than average price, thereby boosting their real incomes.
Everyone is affected by inflation. Some gain while others lose due to inflation. The various economic classes of a country can be producers, households and businesses, wage earners, farmers, fixed income people, borrowers and lenders, investors, and the government. Let us now discuss the effects of inflation on these economic classes. Producers. The rate of increase in the price that the producers receive, that is, the sales price, and the price that the producers pay, that is, the input price, determines whether the producers are net gainers or losers due to the inflation. When the rate of increase in the price received is more than the rate of increase in the price paid, the producer is a net gainer. And on the other hand, when the rate of increase in the price received is less than the rate of increase in the price paid, the producer is a loser. Generally, the price that the producer receives rises much faster than the price that the producer pays. The profit margin of the producer increases and they gain. The demand pull factors such as rise in money supply, rise in income, etc., increases the product prices while the input price remains the same. The increase in the demand for the product creates more demand for inputs, pushing their prices up. But the rate at which product price rises and the rate at which input price rises are different. Along with that, until the labor union creates pressure for wages hike, there will be no change in the wages and salaries paid to the workers. Therefore, the benefit of increase in product price along with low rate increase in input prices and no change in wages and salaries of employees goes to the producer, and the producer becomes the net gainer during the period of inflation. Households and businesses. If the income of the households remains constant, they are likely to suffer due to inflation. An annual rate of 5% inflation means that an item that costs rupees 20,000 a year ago is now likely to cost 21,000. Due to inflation, business houses now need to pay more for the same item that they were able to buy at a lesser price a year ago. Suppose the annual rate of inflation is 5%, a piece of machinery that costs rupees 1 lakh a year ago will now be available for 1 lakh and 5,000. Due to higher level of inflation, the employees also claim higher wages. So there is not only increase in cost of material and equipment, but the business houses operating under an inflationary economy also have to deal with rising wage costs. Wage earners. Due to inflation, whether the wage earners will gain or lose depends on the labor market conditions. Generally, in developed countries like the US, the labor market is organized and competitive. In the organized sector, because of the use of union power, the laborers are compensated for the loss of their purchasing power due to inflation. Therefore, it can be said that in the organized sector, wage earners have gained during the period of inflation. In less developed countries, which are facing large scale open and disguised unemployment, the labor market is divided into organized and unorganized sector. The unorganized sector laborers are not compensated for the loss of their purchasing power due to inflation. Therefore, they are the net losers during the period of inflation. On the other hand, the organized sector laborers are compensated for inflation. Thus, it can be concluded that laborers in unorganized sectors are losers and the laborers in the organized sector are gainers due to inflation. Farmers. During inflation, the prices of the farm products increases much faster than its cost of production, thus leading to higher profits for the farmers. Fixed income class. During the period of inflation, on the one hand, the prices of goods and services increases, and on the other hand, the income of fixed income class people remains constant, which makes the fixed income class people net losers as the purchasing power of their income reduces in proportion to the rate of inflation. This class of people includes teachers, pensioners, laborers, and other employees. Borrowers and lenders. Borrowers tend to gain and the lenders tend to lose during the period of inflation. For example, Mr. X borrowed rupees 10,000 from Mr. Y for 1 year, but now inflation overtook the economy. When Mr. X repays rupees 10,000 to Mr. Y under inflationary situation, actually Mr. X is returning less purchasing power to Mr. Y as compared to what Mr. X had borrowed earlier. Investors. The investment pattern of the investors determines the effect of inflation on investors. Investors are gainers if they had invested their money in equities because of the rise in profits. On the other hand, if investors had invested their money in fixed income securities like bonds, debentures, etc., they are the losers as their income will remain fixed and there is rise in price due to inflation. Government. Due to inflation, the government's yield from personal income tax increases. Since inflation redistributes the income in favor of higher income groups, this enlarges the tax base for the personal income tax as the taxpayer falls into the higher slab rates. Government yield from corporate income tax also increases during the period of inflation. Inflation causes the profit to rise as the output price increases much faster than the input price. Consequently, the government yield from the corporate income tax increases as the producers are required to pay more tax on high profit. Therefore, the government is a net gainer during the period of inflation. Let us now move on to discuss the economic effects of inflation on the distribution of income, distribution of wealth, economic growth, employment, balance of payment, and the general effects of inflation. On distribution of income. The price received and the price paid by different sections of the society, that is, the producers and the consumers, determines the effect of inflation on income distribution. Factor prices such as wages and salaries, rents and royalties, dividend and interest income, profit, and income from self-employment are the prices or income received by the households. Expenditure on consumer goods and production inputs are the prices paid by the households. The impact of inflation on income distribution pattern is negligible when inflation is predictable. Consumers are able to adjust their consumption pattern, and wage earners can move from low wage jobs to high wage jobs only when inflation is predictable. Since inflation is unpredictable and consumers are not able to adjust towards it immediately, it creates a divergence between total prices received and total prices paid by the different sections of the society, and thus affects the income distribution pattern. Generally, when the input prices increases proportionately to the increase in profits, the income distribution remains unaffected. But when the output prices increases much faster than the input price, that is, the profit rises faster than the wage income, the income gets distributed in the favor of profit earners, that is, employers. This happens because of the time lag between the rise in output price and input price. The output price increases first, and as a consequence of increase in output price, the wages paid increase. Thus, the producers get benefited because of inflation as there is redistribution of income in favor of producers. Due to this uneven distribution of income, the rich become richer and the poor become poorer. Inflation transfers the wealth from those who have less of it to those who already have too much of it.
Effects of inflation on distribution of wealth. Price variables, assets and fixed value assets are the two categories of assets made from the point of view of analysis of effects of inflation on distribution of wealth. When the change in the general price level changes the price of the assets are called price variable assets. During the period of inflation, the money value of these assets increases. Price variable assets is further classified as physical assets like land and building, gold, automobiles, equipments, etc., and financial assets like shares and stocks. In case the money value of assets remains constant, even if there is a change in the general level of price, the asset is called fixed value assets. These assets include loans and advances, bonds and deposits with banks and companies. Similar to the fixed value assets, there is fixed value liabilities like car loan, house loan, etc. How inflation affects the money value of price variable assets determines the extent of effect of inflation on the net wealth. When there is no difference in the rate of inflation and the rate at which the price of price variable assets increases, and then there is no change in the assets portfolio and in the wealth distribution. But in case the rate of price increases in the price variable assets is higher than the rate of inflation, inflation affects the distribution of wealth. During the inflation, the income of employers increases at a rate higher than the rate of increase in employees' income. By this, there is more savings by the higher income groups as compared to the low income group. As a result, the high income group people are able to acquire more wealth as compared to the low income group. Thus, due to inflation, the wealthy class of the society is benefited.
On economic growth. The rate of economic growth depends on the rate of capital formation, which in turn depends on the rate of savings and investments. Some economists are of the view that there is a positive relationship between the rate of moderate inflation and the rate of economic growth, as inflation tends to increase the level of savings and investments. Due to the time lag between the rise in price of output and rise in price of input, the profit margin of the producers increases. This increased profit margin of the producers provides them incentives to make investments, which in turn increase the production capacity and the level of output. This increased investment causes growth in the economy. The higher income group and the wealthier people tend to benefit due to inflation, as inflation redistributes the income in their favor. Since the upper income group have a higher propensity to save, inflation causes the savings to rise in the economy. This results in increase in the supply of investable funds and lowers the rate of interest. Lower interest rate causes the investments to increase. Ultimately, the increase in the rate of savings and investments increases the rate of capital formation that causes economic growth in the economy. Some economists are of the view that a positive relationship between inflation and economic growth is inevitable only in the short run. In the long run, since the economic growth is affected by many factors, the relationship between inflation and growth loses its distinctiveness. Galloping and hyperinflation causes hindrance to the growth of an economy. On employment. Economic growth and employment are two sides of the same coin. The economic growth in the country creates additional employment opportunities. It is widely accepted that a moderate rate of inflation affects growth variables like savings, investments, and profits favorably. So it also affects the employment favorably. A high rate of inflation also increases employment opportunities, but it affects the growth adversely. Therefore, the policymakers are faced with a situation of dilemma. If they control the inflation, it will limit the employment opportunities and create unemployment. And on the other hand, if they allow inflation to go on a high rate, then it will affect the growth rate adversely. So there is a need to find out a trade off between inflation and unemployment by the policymakers.
On balance of payment. Balance of payments show account of how much a country has to pay to the rest of the world and how much a country has to receive from the rest of the world. A country receives payments for goods and services that it has exported, whereas it makes payments for goods and services that it has imported. When total payments are more than the total receipts, it's called deficit balance of payment. On the other hand, when total payments are less than the total receipts, it is called surplus balance of payment. Inflation adversely affects the balance of payment. The rising prices under inflation cause the deficit balance of payment to increase. During inflation, a country's imports are more than its exports because inflation causes the domestic goods to become expensive. Due to this, foreigners are not ready to buy our high price goods. As a result, exports fall. On the other side, foreign goods become relatively cheaper and people prefer to buy these relatively cheaper goods. Thereby, import increases. Thus, due to inflation, the gap between receipts and payments widens and deficit in balance of payment increases.
Finally, We shall now discuss the general economic effects of inflation. These are uncertainty. In the event of stable prices, people are uncertain about the cost of their decision, but the significant changes in the average level of price creates an atmosphere of uncertainty and it becomes very difficult to take economic decisions. Money illusion. In the event of inflation, people feel cheated when the higher nominal wages do not buy any additional goods. This occurs because of the confusion in nominal and real value. This phenomenon is called money illusion. For example, there is a 6% rise in the money wages of a worker. He or she feels better off because of the rise in wages. If, however, inflation also rises at 6%, then in real terms, there is no growth in the income of the worker. Generally, this phenomenon occurs when inflation is unanticipated. Bracket creep. Inflation tends to increase everyone's income, and since the tax rates are progressive, that is, higher tax rates for higher income and lower tax rates for lower income, people are confronted with higher tax rates and are pushed into higher tax brackets. This process of paying higher tax with increase in income due to inflation is called bracket creep. By reducing the number of tax brackets and by performing inflation indexing of personal income tax rates, the problem of bracket creep can be reduced. Social tension. Inflation increases social and economic tension in the economy. The tension among labor and management, between government and the society, and amongst consumers may overwhelm a society and its institutions. Inflation stress diminishes the self confidence and the confidence on others. All this hampers the various economic transactions in the country.
Speculation. Due to inflation, not only the level of economic activities changes, but it changes its very nature. Inflation induces people to buy goods and resources now to sell them at higher price after some time. They can derive higher profits if the price rises faster than the expected. This kind of thought motivates people to buy houses, precious metals, commodities and other assets with the purpose to sell them later. But if it becomes too easy to earn profits by indulging in such activities, then there will be few people that will engage in production. Everyone will engage in such type of speculative activities. But such type of speculative activities can lead to a situation of hyperinflation, as everyone will withhold resources from the production process with the hope to sell them later at a higher price. Let us now recapitulate what we have learned in this module. Inflation is a big problem for an economy and it is faced by everyone. Inflation can be favorable or unfavorable depending on the rate of inflation. Moderate rate of inflation is very essential for the growth of an economy, but an unanticipated high rate of inflation develops a feeling of uncertainty amongst the people. There is a myth that everyone is hurt by inflation, but this is not true. Some are hurt by inflation while the others are helped by inflation. There are various economic classes in an economy like producers, wage earners, fixed income class, farmers, etc. Everyone is affected by inflation in one way or the other. Since the price that the producer receives rises much faster than the price that they pay, the producers are gainer due to inflation. Households are likely to suffer due to inflation if their income remains constant as their purchasing power reduces. From inflation, wage earners gain or lose. Depends on whether they are organized or unorganized. In an organized sector, wage earners are gainer as by the use of union power they are compensated for the reduction in their purchasing power due to inflation. But in an unorganized sector, wage earners are losers. Farmers are gainers due to inflation as the farm product prices increase much faster than the cost of production. Fixed income class people like teachers, pensioners, etc. are losers due to inflation as their purchasing power reduces in proportion to the rate of inflation. Borrowers tend to gain and the lenders tend to lose because of inflation. When the investors had invested their money in equities, they are the net gainer. On the other hand, if they had invested in fixed income securities, they are the net loser due to inflation. Governments yield from personal income tax and corporate income tax increases during the period of inflation. When inflation is predictable, the effect of inflation on distribution of income is negligible, as the consumers are able to adjust their consumption pattern. But since inflation is unpredictable, it affects the pattern of income distribution. When the output price increases much faster than the input price, the inflation redistributes income in favor of the receiver of the output price, that is, the producers. There is no effect of inflation on wealth distribution when the price of price variable assets increases at the same rate as that of inflation. But in case the rate of price increase in the price variable assets is higher than the rate of inflation, the wealthy class of the society is benefited. As moderate rate of inflation increases the level of savings and investments, there is a positive relationship between inflation and economic growth. But this exists only in short run, and in the long run, the positive relationship between inflation and economic growth loses its distinctiveness. Moderate rate of inflation affects employment opportunities in the economy favorably. Inflation affects the balance of payments adversely. Due to rise in inflation, exports tend to reduce and imports tend to increase, which causes deficit in balance of payment. Inflation also causes uncertainty, bracket creep, social tensions, money illusion, and feeling of speculation amongst the people.